On a sticky Tuesday morning in late summer, the kind where the air feels thick enough to chew, a family walked through Concourse B of Atlanta's busiest airport, like they'd done it 100 times before, which, in truth, they had. The man wore a soft-looking blazer that had seen better days but still held its shape. The woman a simple linen dress the color of sea glass, and their 2 kids trailed just behind, earbuds dangling, eyes half glued to their phones but not so lost they missed their surroundings. They moved without hurry, without fanfare, blending into the river of travelers rushing to gates, checking bags, arguing with kiosks. To anyone glancing their way, they were just another family trying to get home after a long weekend. But this wasn't just any family. They'd spent the last 3 days visiting relatives in Savannah, barbecues under live oaks, cousins laughing over sweet tea, the kind of slow, sun-drenched time that feels like a reset button for the soul. Now they were heading back to Chicago, tired but content, ready for school and meetings and the familiar rhythm of home. They'd booked their tickets weeks in advance, standard economy, no upgrades, no special requests. They liked flying like regular people. It kept them grounded. And honestly, after everything they'd built over the years, they preferred it that way. No red carpets, no whispered names, just the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived without needing to announce it. Boarding began smoothly. Zone 2, row 24. They found their seats near the wing, window, middle, aisle, and the extra legroom seat they'd paid a few dollars for because their son's knees were growing faster than his shoes. The woman stowed their carry-ons with practiced ease, while the man helped their daughter plug in her headphones. Everything felt normal, routine, the kind of flight you forget 5 minutes after landing. Then the flight attendant appeared. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, with a voice that carried just enough authority to cut through cabin noise. She'd been with the airline for over a decade and prided herself on running a tight ship. Efficiency, order, compliance, those were her pillars. She didn't tolerate slouching, loud-talking, or what she called attitude. And today, something about this family rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was how calmly they moved, how they didn't jump when she asked them to hurry with their bags. Or maybe it was the way the man looked her in the eye when he asked politely if there'd been a mistake with their seat assignment, because the screen said 24AD, but someone else was already in 24C. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low and steady, "but this is our seat, see?" He held up his boarding pass. The attendant glanced at it, then at the passenger already settled in 24C. A young man with headphones on, oblivious. "Sir, I'll handle it. Please step aside so others can board." He nodded and moved into the aisle, waiting patiently, but to her that pause felt like defiance. That calmness read as arrogance. She'd dealt with entitled passengers before, people who thought rules didn't apply to them, and in her mind this was shaping up to be another one. She didn't ask if they'd been misassigned. She didn't check the manifest. She just assumed. "Sir," she said louder now, turning fully toward him, "I asked you to move. You're blocking the aisle." "I'm just waiting to see if there's a mix-up," he replied, still calm. "I don't want to take someone else's seat by accident." Her jaw tightened. "There's no mix-up. If you'd boarded when your zone was called, this wouldn't be an issue." That stung because they had boarded on time. But arguing wouldn't help. He exchanged a look with his wife, who gave a small shake of her head. Let it go. They moved to the back while the attendant sorted out the seat confusion, which, as it turned out, was a gate error. 24C had been double-booked. By the time they were reseated, the mood had shifted. The kids were quiet. The woman kept her eyes forward, fingers lightly gripping the armrest. The man stared out the window at the tarmac, jaw set but silent. Still no one raised their voice. No one made a scene. But the flight attendant had already made up her mind. As the cabin door closed and the jet bridge retracted, she walked briskly to the front and spoke into her headset, voice low but urgent. "We've got a compliance issue in 24. Passenger was argumentative during boarding, refused to follow instructions. I recommend we deplane them before pushback." The gate agent, hearing the tone, didn't question it. In airline culture, crew authority is rarely second-guessed mid-process, especially when safety or order is cited. Within minutes, a customer service rep and 2 security officers appeared at the aircraft door. Passengers watched, some curious, most indifferent, as the family was quietly asked to gather their things. The woman didn't cry. The man didn't yell. Their son looked confused. Their daughter bit her lip hard, eyes glistening but dry. They collected their bags in silence, walked down the jet bridge without looking back, and stepped out into the humid Georgia air, where the roar of taxiing planes drowned out whatever words they might have wanted to say. Outside, the man pulled out his phone and dialed their driver. His wife put a hand on their daughter's shoulder and whispered something that made the girl nod just once. They stood near a quiet corner of the terminal entrance, away from the crowds waiting. Not angry, just deeply, quietly disappointed, because what hurt wasn't being removed. It was being misread, reduced, judged not by who they were, but by how they looked, how they spoke, how they carried themselves in a moment of simple confusion. What the flight attendant didn't know, couldn't have known, because they never flaunted it, was that this family didn't just fly this airline. They owned it, not in a ceremonial way, not as silent investors, but as the driving force behind its recent turnaround, the strategic decisions, the customer service overhaul, the commitment to treating every passenger like a human being. Regardless of ticket class, they'd built something they believed in, and today, the very system they'd tried to improve had failed them in the most personal way possible. But none of that mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the sting of being treated like a problem instead of a person, and as they waited for their car, watching planes lift off into the hazy sky, they wondered how many others had walked this same path, removed, dismissed, erased, without anyone ever knowing their story. The flight attendant, back inside the cabin, finished her safety demo with crisp precision. She felt justified. Order had been restored. The flight would depart on time. She didn't think about them again, until much later when the truth landed like a thunderclap, and everything she thought she knew about power, perception, and professionalism would be turned upside down. But that was still hours away. For now, the plane taxied toward the runway, and the family stood in the heat, breathing slowly, holding on to each other not as owners, not as executives, but simply as people who'd been told, without words, that they didn't belong. The air outside the terminal was thick with exhaust and humidity, the kind that clings to your skin like a second layer. The family stood near a shaded alcove by a service entrance, away from the main flow of travelers. No one spoke at first. The daughter kept her eyes on the ground, scuffing the toe of her sneaker against the concrete. Her brother leaned against a railing, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. Their mother pulled a water bottle from her tote and handed it to her daughter without a word. The father stood a few feet away, phone pressed to his ear, voice low but steady as he gave their driver directions. It wasn't anger they felt, not yet. It was something heavier, quieter, disbelief mostly, like they'd stepped into a scene from someone else's life. They'd done everything right, arrived early, followed instructions, stayed calm. And still they'd been treated like trouble, like they were the problem. A few minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver, a man who'd worked for them for years, stepped out quickly. He didn't ask what happened. He just opened the doors, took their bags, and gave the father a look that said, "I've got you." They climbed in, the cool air from the vents a small relief. As they drove away from the terminal, the daughter finally spoke. Why did she do that? Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. Sometimes people see what they expect to see, not what's really there. The boy snorted. She didn't even listen. No, the father said quietly from the front seat. She didn't. They didn't head straight home. Instead, the father asked the driver to take them to a quiet hotel near the airport, a place they sometimes used for layovers or late meetings. They needed space to breathe, to process. The hotel lobby was calm, all soft lighting and muted colors. They checked in under a different name, something generic, and rode the elevator up in silence. In their suite, the mother poured glasses of water while the kids flopped onto the couch. The father walked to the window and looked out at the runway below. Planes were taking off one after another, tiny metal birds disappearing into the clouds. One of them was the flight they were supposed to be on. He wondered if anyone on board had questioned what happened. Probably not. These things rarely made waves unless someone made noise, and they weren't the type to cause a scene. Still, the injustice of it sat like a stone in his chest. Downstairs, back at the gate, the flight attendant finished her pre-flight checks with a sense of satisfaction. The cabin was quiet now. Passengers settled, seatbelts fastened. She'd handled the situation the way she'd been trained, swiftly, firmly, without emotion. Safety and order came first. That's what they'd drilled into her during training. If someone disrupts the process, you remove them. No exceptions. She didn't know the family had double-checked their boarding passes. She didn't know the gate agent had misassigned the seat. She didn't know the man had spoken politely, not defiantly. All she remembered was the pause, the eye contact, the feeling that he wasn't backing down fast enough. In her mind, that was enough. But up in the cockpit, the captain was doing his final manifest review, a routine step before pushback. He scrolled through the passenger list, cross-referencing frequent flyers, VIPs, and special notes. And then he saw it. 2 names. Names he recognized instantly, not because they were celebrities, but because they'd been in every major company meeting for the past 5 years. Names that appeared on internal strategy decks, shareholder reports, and leadership retreat invites. His stomach dropped. He tapped his co-pilot on the shoulder. "Did you see who just got removed from 24? The co-pilot frowned. "The family?" "Yeah." Said they were being uncooperative. The captain shook his head slowly. "That's not just a family. That's the family." He grabbed the radio. "Gate control, this is Flight 218. We need to hold pushback." "Repeat, hold pushback. Urgent internal matter." Within minutes, the gate agent was on the phone with corporate headquarters. Voices rose in hushed panic. Someone pulled up security footage. Another called the hotel where the family often stayed during layovers. Within 20 minutes, confirmation came back. Yes, they were there. And yes, they'd been removed from the aircraft. Meanwhile, in the hotel room, the mother was on a call with their assistant, arranging a new flight for the next morning. First class this time. Not because they wanted special treatment, but because they couldn't risk another misunderstanding. As she hung up, there was a knock at the door. It was the station manager from the airport, flushed, sweating slightly, holding a folder like it was a peace offering. He introduced himself, voice trembling just a little, and apologized profusely. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame the flight attendant outright. He just said, "We failed you, and I'm here to make it right." The father invited him in. They sat in the small sitting area, the kids in the bedroom with the door slightly ajar, listening. The station manager explained that corporate had been notified, that the flight was delayed, that the crew was being briefed. Then he asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. "Did she know who you were?" The father looked at his wife. She shook her head. "No," he said. She had no idea. The station manager exhaled, shoulders slumping slightly. That answer changed everything. Because if this had happened to anyone else, a teacher, a nurse, a student, the outcome would have been the same. And that was the real problem. It wasn't about status. It was about assumption. About who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. Back at the plane, the flight attendant was called to the front. The captain spoke to her in a low voice, away from passengers. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just showed her the names on the manifest and said, "These people built this airline, and today we made them feel like they didn't belong." Her face went pale. She stammered something about following procedure, about not knowing. The captain nodded. "I know you didn't, but that's the point." The flight finally pushed back an hour late. No announcement was made about why. Passengers grumbled about delays but moved on. Life went on. But for one crew member, the world had tilted. For one family, trust had cracked. And for the airline, a quiet reckoning had begun, not with press releases or lawsuits, but with a single, uncomfortable truth. Policies mean nothing if the people enforcing them don't see the humans behind the tickets. That night, as the family ordered room service and tried to laugh over burnt fries, they didn't talk about ownership or power. They talked about how it felt to be invisible in plain sight, and they made a silent promise to each other. This wouldn't be the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the hotel curtains, soft and golden, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis the day before. The family ate breakfast in the quiet dining room downstairs. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with care. There was no bitterness in their voices now, just a kind of tired clarity. They'd slept, they'd talked, and they'd decided they weren't going to disappear. Not this time. They didn't want headlines. They didn't want revenge. But they also couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Because if it could happen to them, people with resources, with influence, with the kind of quiet authority that usually opens doors, then how many others had been walked off planes, questioned in terminals or treated like suspects just for existing while black? That thought settled over the table like a quiet weight. Back at the airline's corporate offices, chaos had given way to damage control. Emergency calls had flown through the night. The CEO, a woman who'd worked closely with the family for years, had stayed up until 3 a.m., reviewing security footage, crew logs, and passenger statements. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly, but her silence was worse. She knew this wasn't just a miscommunication, it was a symptom. By mid-morning, a formal request landed on her desk. The family wanted to meet. Not with lawyers, not with PR teams, just a private conversation, with the frontline staff involved if they were willing. No cameras, no recordings, just people talking. The flight attendant had spent the night wide awake. She replayed every second of the boarding process in her head. Had she been too quick to judge? Had she mistaken calmness for defiance, dignity for disrespect? She'd always prided herself on fairness, but now she wondered, was her fairness only extended to people who looked, spoke, or moved in ways she recognized as cooperative? The question gnawed at her. She agreed to the meeting not because she was told to, but because she needed to understand. The gathering took place in a small training room at the airline's operations center, far from the polished executive floors. Folding chairs, a whiteboard, bottled water on a side table. The family arrived first, dressed simply, jeans, button-downs, no logos, no signals of status. When the flight attendant walked in, she hesitated in the doorway. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. The father stood and offered a handshake. She took it, eyes downcast at first, then slowly meeting his gaze. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "We know you didn't mean harm, but we need to talk about what happened and why it happened." What followed wasn't an interrogation. It was a conversation. The mother spoke about how it felt to watch her daughter shrink into herself as they were escorted off the plane. The son talked about how he'd never thought twice about flying before, but now he wondered if he'd be seen as too big, too quiet, or too something the next time he boarded. The daughter, after a long pause, admitted she'd cried in the car, not because she was embarrassed, but because she didn't understand why they were treated like they didn't belong in a space they literally helped create. The flight attendant listened. Really listened. At one point, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I thought I was doing my job," she said.
"Keeping things orderly."
"But I didn't see you." "Not really. I saw a story I'd already written in my head." That honesty hung in the air, fragile but real. The CEO joined them halfway through, not as a boss, but as a witness. She didn't defend the system. Instead, she asked, "How do we fix this, not just for you, but for everyone who walks through our doors?" The family didn't have a ready-made answer, but they had an idea. What if frontline staff helped design the next round of customer service training? Not top-down lectures, but real workshops, led by people who'd lived both sides of the experience. Flight attendants, gate agents, even baggage handlers, working alongside passengers from all walks of life to build something better. The flight attendant surprised everyone by speaking up. "I'd volunteer," she said, "if you'll have me." Over the next few weeks, that small meeting sparked something unexpected. A task force formed, not with executives in suits, but with crew members who'd faced similar moments of doubt, confusion, or bias. They met weekly, sharing stories, dissecting scenarios, testing new language for de-escalation, new ways to check assumptions before acting. The family attended some sessions not as owners but as participants. They brought coffee, asked questions, and mostly listened. Meanwhile, the airline quietly updated its internal protocols, not with punitive measures but with empathy-based training modules. Role-playing exercises now included scenarios about implicit bias, cultural humility, and the difference between compliance and connection. Supervisors were taught to ask, "What did you see?" before "What did they do?" shifting focus from behavior to perception. The flight attendant returned to work after a short leave, not punished, but changed. She still ran a tight cabin, but now she paused. She made eye contact. She asked questions before making assumptions, and when a nervous elderly passenger once fumbled with his seatbelt, she knelt beside him and said, "Take your time. We've got you." It was a small moment, unnoticed by most. But it mattered. Back home, the family didn't broadcast what had happened. They didn't post about it online or give interviews. But they did something quieter and maybe more powerful. They kept showing up. They flew the same airline, same economy seats, same calm demeanor. And slowly, crew members began to recognize them, not by name but by presence. The way they treated gate agents with respect. The way they thanked flight attendants by name. The way they modeled the kind of humanity they hoped the system would reflect. One evening, months later, the same flight attendant found herself on a flight where the family was seated in her section. She froze for just a second when she saw them. Then she walked over, smiled, and said, "Welcome back. I'm glad you're still flying with us." The mother returned the smile. We never stopped believing in what this airline could be. And in that exchange, simple, human, unscripted, something shifted. Not just between two people, but in the quiet understanding that change doesn't always come from outrage. Sometimes it comes from showing up again with grace and giving others a chance to do better. Weeks turned into months, and the incident that had once sent ripples through the airline's leadership began to settle. Not into silence, but into something more lasting. The family didn't vanish after their quiet meeting with the crew. They stayed involved, not as distant owners issuing directives from a boardroom, but as steady, grounded presences who showed up when it mattered. They attended training sessions not to inspect, but to listen. They asked questions like, "What would make your job easier?" And "When do you feel most unsure how to respond?" Questions that made staff lean forward instead of bracing for criticism. The flight attendant, meanwhile, found herself changed in ways she hadn't expected. She'd always believed her job was about safety, efficiency, and order. And it was, but now she saw those things differently. Safety wasn't just about seatbelts and emergency exits. It was also about making people feel seen, not scrutinized. Efficiency didn't mean rushing people into compliance. It meant creating space for confusion, for mistakes, for humanity. And order? Real order came not from control, but from mutual respect. She started speaking up in crew briefings. Not to complain, but to share. Last week, she told her team one morning, a passenger didn't understand the overhead bin rules. Instead of telling him what he did wrong, I showed him how to fit his bag. He thanked me like I'd done him a huge favor. That's when I realized sometimes people just need help, not correction. Her words stuck. Others began sharing their own moments. Times they'd misread a tired parent as rude, or assumed a quiet passenger was uncooperative. Slowly, a new language took root among the crew. Less about enforcing, more about connecting. The airline's leadership noticed. Not through reports or metrics, but through the tone in the break rooms. The way gate agents greeted passengers. The fewer escalations to supervisors. Something was shifting from the inside out. Encouraged, the CEO greenlit a pilot program, a passenger dignity initiative, co-designed by frontline staff and informed by real passenger experiences, including the families. The initiative wasn't flashy. No slogans, no press releases. It began with simple changes. Gate agents were trained to say, "Let me check that for you," instead of, "That's not how it works." Flight attendants learned to ask, "Is everything okay?" before assuming someone was being difficult. Security protocols were reviewed to ensure they didn't rely on subjective judgments like nervous behavior or uncooperative tone, things that too often reflected bias more than risk. The family helped shape these guidelines, but they insisted the crew lead the rollout. "This isn't about us," the father said during one planning session. "It's about making sure no one else feels what we felt." One afternoon, the flight attendant was asked to help train new hires. She stood in front of a room of wide-eyed recruits, her palms slightly sweaty, and told her story. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a turning point. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. But doing the right thing starts with seeing the person in front of you, not the role you've assigned them. Afterward, a young trainee approached her. "Did they forgive you?" she asked quietly. The flight attendant paused. "I don't know if it was about forgiveness. It was about understanding and giving me a chance to grow." That moment stayed with her because it wasn't just about one mistake. It was about what happens after. The choice to learn, to change, to do better. Back home, the family watched these changes unfold with quiet pride. Their daughter, once shaken by the experience, now talked about studying psychology or organizational behavior. I want to help systems see people, she told her parents over dinner. Her brother, who'd grown more observant since that day at the airport, started volunteering with a youth group that taught conflict resolution in schools. Even small actions, he realized, could shift how people treated each other. The airline never made the story public. There were no viral videos, no dramatic press conferences, and that was intentional. The family believed real change didn't need an audience, it needed consistency. They knew that if they'd gone public, the narrative would have been twisted. Billionaires humiliate flight attendant, or airline grovels to powerful owners. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was messier, quieter, and far more human. A moment of misjudgment followed by humility, followed by repair, and repair takes time. 6 months after the incident, the flight attendant was promoted, not to management, but to a new role. Lead facilitator for the Passenger Dignity Program. She traveled to different hubs, working with crews to adapt the training to their local realities. In Dallas, she learned how language barriers created tension. In Seattle, she saw how weather delays frayed tempers in ways that weren't about race, but still required empathy. She listened more than she spoke, and in doing so became someone others trusted. One evening, after a long training day in Chicago, she boarded a red-eye flight home. As she settled into her jump seat, she noticed a familiar face in 18B, the mother from that Atlanta flight, reading a book, earplugs in, looking utterly ordinary. Their eyes met. A small smile passed between them. No words were needed. Later, during beverage service, the flight attendant brought her a bottle of water without being asked. "Still flying coach, I see," she said gently. The woman looked up and smiled. "Best place to remember why we do this." They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. The work they were both doing now was the conversation. Meanwhile, the airline began seeing subtle but meaningful shifts in customer feedback. Fewer complaints about rude staff. More notes like, "The crew made me feel welcome," or "They treated my mom like a person, not a problem." Retention among frontline employees improved too. People felt heard, not just by passengers but by their own company. None of it was perfect. Mistakes still happened. Biases didn't vanish overnight. But there was now a framework for repair, a way to say, "I got that wrong," and mean it without shame shutting the door on growth. And that, more than anything, was what the family had hoped for. Not punishment, not praise, just the chance for people to see each other clearly and respond with kindness, not fear. As the months rolled on, the story became less about who owned the airline and more about who it served. And in that shift, something rare took root. Trust. Not the kind that's demanded, but the kind that's earned. One honest conversation, one corrected assumption, one act of quiet courage at a time. A year after the incident, the airline rolled out its updated customer engagement program to every hub in the country. There were no banners, no grand announcements, just a quiet shift in how things were done. New hires spent their first week not just learning safety protocols, but practicing conversations that began with curiosity instead of control. Supervisors were trained to ask, "What did you notice?" before jumping to conclusions. And every quarter, frontline staff gathered in small groups to share stories. Real ones, messy ones, about moments when they'd misjudged someone, or been misjudged themselves. The flight attendant who'd once asked for a family to be removed now led many of those sessions. She didn't wear her experience like a badge of shame or redemption. She carried it like a lesson, one she was still learning. "I used to think professionalism meant keeping distance," she told a room of gate agents in Denver. "Now I know it means showing up fully, with your eyes open and your heart ready." Passengers began to notice the difference, even if they couldn't name it. A grandmother traveling alone for the first time said a crew member walked her all the way to baggage claim like, "I was their aunt." A college student missed his connection and expected to be brushed off, but instead, the agent stayed late to rebook him and even printed a map to his new gate. These weren't acts of heroism. They were small human choices, the kind that add up when a system decides people matter more than perfection. The family kept flying. Still coach, still quiet, still unrecognized by most. But among the crew, their presence carried a quiet weight, not because of who they were on paper, but because of how they'd responded when they were wronged. They hadn't demanded punishment. They hadn't walked away. They'd leaned in with patience and purpose and helped build something better. One spring morning, the daughter, now a high school senior, boarded a flight to visit a college campus. As she stowed her bag, the flight attendant paused. "You look familiar," she said gently. The girl smiled. "My family flies this airline a lot." The attendant nodded, then added, "You'll be treated with respect today, always." It wasn't special treatment. It was the standard now. Back at headquarters, the Passenger Dignity Initiative had become part of the company's core values, not as a slogan on a wall, but as a living practice. Employee surveys showed higher morale, especially among staff of color who'd long felt caught between serving passengers and defending their own humanity. Customer satisfaction scores ticked upward, not because of faster boarding or fancier snacks, but because people felt seen. The real test came during a major winter storm that grounded hundreds of flights. Chaos usually brought out the worst in passengers and staff alike. But this time something different happened. Gate agents stayed late, not because they had to, but because they knew the faces behind the tickets. Crews shared meals with stranded travelers. When a man became agitated after missing a funeral, a flight attendant sat with him for 20 minutes just listening. No one called security. No one raised their voice. They handled it like humans helping humans. Afterward, the CEO sent a note to all staff. "You showed today what this company is really made of." The family read that message over breakfast. They didn't reply. They didn't need to. They'd seen it in action. What never happened was just as important as what did. There were no lawsuits, no viral outrage, no careers destroyed in the name of accountability. Instead, there was space for mistake, for growth, for repair. And in a world that often demands punishment over understanding, that space was radical. The flight attendant eventually wrote a short piece for the company newsletter, not about herself, but about the power of pausing. "Before I speak," she wrote, "I ask myself, am I reacting to what's happening or to what I think is happening?" That half-second changes everything. Her words were printed on training cards now carried by new hires. Years later, long after the headlines would have faded if there had been any, people still talked about that time, not as a scandal but as a turning point. Not because someone got fired, but because someone chose to learn. Because a family chose grace over grievance. Because an entire system decided it could do better and then did. The story never made the news. It didn't need to. Its impact lived in the way a gate agent now kneels to talk to a child at eye level. In the way a passenger says thank you and means it. In the quiet confidence of a teenager boarding a plane alone, knowing she'll be treated like she belongs, because she does. Real change rarely arrives with sirens and spotlights. It slips in through open doors held a second longer. Through voices that choose curiosity over certainty. Through moments when someone decides that dignity isn't earned. It's given freely to everyone, and sometimes it starts with a family being asked to leave a plane they helped build, and choosing, instead, to stay and rebuild something even more important. Trust. That's how it ended. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 small acts of seeing each other clearly and responding with kindness every single day.